In August 1944, the German High Command was convinced that the American advance across France would soon grind to a halt. At Wehrmacht headquarters in East Prussia, Generaloberst Alfred Jodl studied intelligence reports with satisfaction. The Allies had moved faster than anyone thought possible, pushing nearly 400 miles inland from the Normandy beaches in a matter of weeks. Yet for Jodl and his colleagues, this rapid progress could not continue. The mathematics of supply lines seemed merciless. Patton's Third Army, spearheading the Allied advance, had extended so far that fuel, ammunition, and spare parts could no longer keep up. German generals, hardened by years of operational experience, calculated that Patton would be immobilized within days, perhaps hours. No modern army, they believed, could sustain such momentum without collapsing under its own logistical weight. Their confidence was not unfounded. The Wehrmacht itself had pioneered the concept of blitzkrieg, fast, combined, arms warfare designed to overwhelm the enemy before he could organize resistance. Yet German commanders also knew better than anyone that speed had limits. In Russia, their armored spearheads had often outpaced supply columns. Tanks sat idle for lack of fuel, while horse-drawn wagons, which still made up 80% of German transport, struggled on muddy roads. Railroads, built on different gauges, left supplies stranded hundreds of miles behind the front. Even when victories seemed imminent, logistics had pulled the reins tight. For German officers looking at the American situation in 1944, the outcome seemed obvious. Patton's thrust would stall just as theirs had. History, they felt, was about to repeat itself. The calculations were indeed sobering. A single Sherman tank guzzled half a mile per gallon on roads and far worse cross-country. An infantry division required roughly 700 tons of supplies every day, while an armored division needed closer to 1,000. Patton commanded 12 divisions spread across a 60-mile front. That meant an appetite of more than 12,000 tons daily, all of it dragged across nearly 400 miles of devastated French roads and bridges. General Major Siegfried Westphal, one of the Wehrmacht's shrewdest staff officers, expressed the consensus in late August. Even if the Americans had unlimited trucks, which they did not, and perfect roads, which they certainly lacked, they could not possibly sustain such consumption. He concluded that Patton's advance would expire within 48 hours. Physical laws, he wrote, could not be violated, not even by American industry. Yet the Germans had overlooked something crucial. Just 125 miles away, nearly 60 trucks were already rolling eastward in an audacious experiment that defied every convention of military science. Headlights blazed at night in open defiance of blackout discipline. Convoys surged forward in endless succession, carrying over 12,000 tons of supplies every 24 hours. It was called the Red Ball Express, and it was about to overturn every German assumption about the limits of mechanized warfare. Within 72 hours, Patton's immobilized. Tanks would be smashing through German defenses along the Seine. Within a week, Paris would be liberated. Within a month, Allied forces would be at the German border. The Wehrmacht's most experienced officers, men who believed they understood logistics better than anyone, were about to be taught a brutal lesson. In modern warfare, logistics was not merely support. It was strategy. The Red Ball Express began as a desperate improvisation. On August 25, 1944, in a requisitioned French chateau near Le Mans, Lieutenant Colonel Laurent Ayres of the Motor Transport Service addressed a room of skeptical officers. Traditional supply methods, rail lines, scheduled convoys, carefully distributed depots, were collapsing under the strain of Patton's furious pace. If something radical wasn't attempted, the Third Army would indeed stall. Ayres proposed a bold solution: create a one-way highway system from Cherbourg and the Normandy beaches straight to the front. Trucks would operate 20 hours a day, stopping only for fuel or emergencies. A minimum of 12,500 tons would be moved daily, no matter the cost. The name was borrowed from American railroad terminology, where a red ball freight indicated a shipment that had absolute priority. So too would this convoy system. Absolute priority, no delays, no excuses. Two parallel one-way roads would be designated, one for loaded trucks heading forward, one for empties returning. Convoys would leave at 5-minute intervals, averaging 35 miles per hour, headlights blazing even at night. Military police would clear slow vehicles from the route, while mobile maintenance units stationed every 50 miles would cannibalize parts or perform roadside triage repairs. In essence, it was to be a supply line run not like a military operation, but like an industrial assembly line on wheels. By any textbook of logistics, such an operation was impossible. Colonel Charles O. Thrasher, who commanded the advance section of the communications zone, looked at the numbers and declared it could not be done. Nearly 6,000 vehicles operating at 90% availability, running non-stop for weeks, was unheard of. Yet within 36 hours the impossible was rolling. On August 26, convoys from the 3,916th Quartermaster Truck Company began their runs, each GMC CCKW2 and a half-ton truck, nicknamed the Deuce and a Half, groaning under loads of artillery shells, gasoline cans and rations. The men behind the wheels formed the backbone of the operation. Of the 23 0 drivers who would eventually serve, 3 waters were African American soldiers serving in a still segregated army. In the United States, they could not eat in white restaurants or use white facilities, but in France they were entrusted with keeping Patton's army alive. They painted slogans on their trucks: Patton's Blood Bank, Hitler Here We Come, Detroit to Berlin Express. They developed their own rules of the road. Any vehicle under 20 miles per hour was a roadblock. Breakdowns were shoved into ditches. Slower trucks pulled aside without question. Within days, they had forged a culture of improvisation and grit that astonished German observers. From the German perspective, what was unfolding seemed like madness. Reconnaissance units reported convoys stretching for 20 kilometers, headlights blazing, vehicles nose to tail without spacing. It was everything their doctrine warned against: perfect targets for air attack, artillery fire, or traffic collapse. Yet when German officers peered from concealment, they saw something they could not explain. The convoys never stopped. Trucks passed at 30-second intervals, day and night, in a rhythm that seemed beyond human endurance. General Lieutenant Edgar Feuchtinger of the 21st Panzer Division reported in disbelief, "The enemy operates a supply system beyond our comprehension. They don't hide, don't disperse, don't follow any rules we understand. It's not military science. It's mass production applied to war." This was precisely the point. Where German doctrine emphasized conservation, discipline and concealment, the Americans relied on redundancy, improvisation and sheer volume. Where German commanders planned meticulously to prevent failures, the Americans assumed failure and planned around it. If 30% of trucks broke down, there were always enough left to deliver the goods. If a bridge collapsed, engineers built a bypass overnight. If fuel ran low, new dumps were created every 25 miles. What the Germans saw as waste and chaos was in fact industrial power unleashed, an entirely different way of waging war. By the end of August, the Red Ball Express was delivering nearly 13,000 tons daily, far more than German officers believed possible. The system consumed staggering amounts of fuel, over 300,000 gallons daily just for the convoys themselves. But even this was sustained thanks to Operation Pluto, the underwater pipelines pumping gasoline from England to France. For the Germans, it was bewildering. They had assumed that American reliance on machines would cripple them as it had crippled the Wehrmacht in Russia. Instead, American machines kept rolling, sustained by a logistics philosophy the Germans had never imagined. The first week of the Red Ball Express shattered the illusion that Patton's advance was doomed. Far from halting, the American drive was accelerating. As the Red Ball Express hit full stride in late August 1944, it quickly became clear that this was not merely a supply operation, but an entirely new form of warfare. Within a week of its launch, convoys were leaving every 5 minutes from the Normandy beachhead, each averaging 60 to 70 vehicles, each vehicle carrying 5 to 7 tons of supplies. At any given moment, more than 50 trucks were in motion on French roads. In its first 7 days alone, nearly 90 tons of material were delivered to the front. German intelligence intercepted the numbers from captured American documents and dismissed them as impossible propaganda. Yet reconnaissance flights and field reports confirmed what they could hardly believe. It was all real, and it was accelerating. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. Trucks traveled nearly 700 miles round trip, averaging 14 hours of driving in one direction, plus brief turnarounds at depots before heading back. The convoys moved in tight formations, headlights blazing even at night, completely discarding blackout discipline. To German observers, this was lunacy. Continuous columns with no spacing made perfect targets for air raids or artillery strikes. But the Luftwaffe, by this stage of the war, was largely grounded by fuel shortages and Allied air superiority. The Americans calculated correctly that the risk was minimal and the gain enormous. It was a gamble, but one weighted heavily in their favor. Behind this apparent recklessness was a system of improvisations that turned chaos into functionality. Every 50 miles along the route, mobile maintenance units were stationed to deal with the inevitable breakdowns. On average, 800 trucks a day suffered mechanical problems, blown tires, overheating engines, broken axles. The solution was pragmatic. If a truck could not be repaired in 15 minutes, it was shoved into a ditch and cannibalized for parts. Mechanics became triage doctors, reviving what they could, stripping what they could not, and keeping the river of trucks flowing. Replacement engines were swapped in under an hour using mobile cranes, a feat that astonished German engineers accustomed to meticulous maintenance schedules. The American philosophy was simple: redundancy and mass production trumped precision. If one truck was lost, 10 more were ready. If an engine failed, another could be bolted in. Where German mechanics treated each vehicle as a precious asset requiring careful preservation, the Americans treated trucks as expendable units in a vast production system. This mindset bewildered German officers. For them, waste was a sign of weakness. For the Americans, it was the price of unstoppable momentum. Fuel management, perhaps the most critical challenge of all, became a marvel in itself. The Red Ball Express consumed 300 gallons of gasoline daily just to keep its trucks running. This was more fuel than many German armies received in an entire week, yet supplies never ran short. Part of the reason was Operation Pluto, a network of undersea pipelines laid beneath the English Channel that pumped gasoline directly into France. From there, tanker trucks and forward fuel dumps distributed supplies at 25-mile intervals along the Red Ball routes. Drivers rarely had to wait more than 10 minutes for refueling, an efficiency unheard of in German operations. General Major Walter Warlimont, analyzing aerial photographs, was stunned. He observed that American forward fuel dumps were larger than Germany's entire strategic reserves. The Americans, he remarked bitterly, burn more gasoline moving gasoline than we allocate to entire panzer divisions. As the convoys thundered through villages and countryside, French civilians stood in awe. For years they had endured German occupation, where even basic necessities like bread and soap were rationed. Now, thousands of American trucks roared past, carrying food, fuel, and ammunition in quantities that seemed endless. Red Ball drivers often tossed candy, chocolate, or cigarettes to children who lined the roads, gestures that further reinforced the image of American abundance. To civilians, the convoys were not just supply lines. They were proof that German defeat was inevitable. The psychological effect was immense, both on the French population and on German troops who could hear the endless drone of truck engines through the night. German reconnaissance units reported their observations with growing alarm. From hills overlooking the routes, they counted convoys of 1,000 vehicles per hour, headlights visible for 20 kilometers. Generals accustomed to thinking in terms of scarcity simply could not comprehend this flood of material. General Edgar Feuchtinger, commander of the 21st Panzer Division, confessed in a report that the Americans seemed to have abandoned military science altogether. They ignored camouflage, ignored discipline, ignored the rules of economy that had defined European warfare for centuries. Instead, they relied on an alien principle, mass production. The results on the battlefield were equally shocking. German doctrine assumed that an armored division could sustain advances of 20 to 30 miles a day under ideal conditions. Yet Patton's divisions, fed by the Red Ball Express, routinely advanced 40 to 60 miles daily for weeks on end. On September 1st, for example, the 4th Armored Division covered 35 miles by noon, paused briefly to refuel, and then advanced another 32 miles by evening. Such rapid advances shredded German defensive planning, which assumed they had days to reposition. Instead, American tanks arrived in hours, supported by artillery barrages made possible by the endless stream of Red Ball trucks. For the Germans, it was as if the laws of war had been suspended. General Heinz Guderian, father of Blitzkrieg, at first refused to believe reports that Patton's armored units were advancing 60 miles in a single day. He insisted that no armored force could possibly maintain such speed. Mechanical failures alone should have crippled them. Yet intercepted American radio traffic confirmed the reality. Worse still, the Americans were so confident that they broadcast positions openly, without encryption, knowing that they could move faster than German forces could react. What unnerved German commanders most was the contrast between American abundance and their own crippling shortages. In some German units, infantrymen received only 3 bullets per day, while American forces were supplied with millions of rounds. Artillery units on the German side rationed 50 shells per gun, while American batteries fired without restriction, sometimes expending 100 shells in a single day. The Red Ball Express ensured that such extravagance never faltered. To German officers, this disparity was not just military. It was psychological. Wehrmacht soldiers, hearing the endless rumble of trucks at night, came to believe resistance was futile. Some prisoners later confessed that the sound of convoys alone convinced them the war was lost. For the men driving those trucks, the task was grueling and dangerous. Many operated for 72 hours straight, sustained by stimulants like benzedrine, often hallucinating from exhaustion. Accidents were common. Trucks overturned on narrow roads, collided in fog, or burst into flames from overheated engines. In just 3 months of operation, 300 drivers were killed, yet morale remained high. These soldiers, most of them African American, understood that they were making history. Every mile driven was another nail in the coffin of Nazi ideology. Denied equal rights at home, they were nonetheless the indispensable lifeline of the most celebrated general in Europe. By early September, German commanders realized that their calculations had been overturned by something they had never imagined: logistics conducted as industrial warfare. They began to admit, often reluctantly, that they were not merely fighting an enemy army, but an entire civilization mobilized for war. Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Germany's most respected commanders, summed up the despair: "If these reports are accurate, we face not a superior army, but a superior civilization. They make no effort to hide because they do not fear us. They waste resources because they have infinite resources. We cannot defeat this with tactics." The Red Ball Express had not just kept Patton moving, it had shattered the intellectual framework of German military science. The Wehrmacht had pioneered fast warfare, but never solved the logistical riddle that accompanied it. The Americans, through sheer industrial might and improvisational daring, had solved it on the fly. For the first time, German officers began to realize that the war was not just a contest of soldiers and tanks, but of factories, trucks, and drivers. And in that contest, the outcome was already decided. By the first week of September 1944, the Red Ball Express was no longer a desperate improvisation. It had become the beating heart of the Allied advance across France. In just 7 days of continuous operation, it had proven that supply could not only keep pace with Patton's hungry Third Army, but could accelerate its speed beyond anything the Germans had prepared for. What was supposed to be a short-lived emergency measure was now a permanent artery of war, pumping lifeblood to the front in volumes that shattered conventional understanding of logistics. The statistics were mind-bending. Between August 25 and September 5, convoys delivered nearly 90 tons of supplies. Each truck carried 5 tons on average, sometimes overloaded to 7. Convoys departed every 5 minutes, day and night, moving at 35 miles per hour. Drivers rotated quickly at depots, often in as little as 2 hours, before heading back on the return leg. With thousands of trucks in constant motion, at any given time 5,000 vehicles were scattered along the French highways, a river of steel and rubber flowing eastward. The round trip was nearly 700 miles, yet the system functioned like clockwork, or more accurately, like an assembly line stretched across a continent. One of the great secrets of the Red Ball Express was its adaptability. The Americans did not cling to rigid procedures or doctrines, as the Germans so often did. Instead, they improvised constantly, turning obstacles into solutions. When bridges collapsed, engineers built bypasses in hours, using rubble from bombed buildings as roadbeds. When traffic jams clogged the main routes, drivers carved out alternate paths, commandeering French buses or even captured German vehicles to keep men moving. Some of these captured trucks were hastily painted olive drab and pressed into American service, adding to the chaotic yet effective system. Breakdowns were inevitable, and the numbers were staggering. Roughly 1,800 trucks failed daily. But the maintenance system, mobile and ruthless, kept the convoys rolling. Mechanics treated vehicles with battlefield triage. Fix it in 15 minutes or push it aside. Salvage teams cannibalized wrecks on the spot, stripping usable parts and discarding the rest. Engines were swapped out in 45 minutes, an astonishing feat that German officers could scarcely believe. Tires, consumed at a rate of 10,000 per week, were treated as expendable items. By German standards, such waste was unthinkable. By American standards, it was simply the cost of doing business. The Americans understood that speed mattered more than perfection. Trucks were expected to burn out quickly. Their average operational life on the Red Ball routes was 10,000 miles instead of the usual 30,000. Yet replacements were already waiting in French ports. Ships unloaded hundreds of new vehicles every week, sent straight into service. The same applied to drivers. If one became sick, exhausted, or injured, replacements were trained in 2 days and thrown into the rotation. This ability to accept staggering losses without slowing down baffled the Germans, who carefully husbanded their dwindling resources. Where the Wehrmacht saw catastrophic waste, the Americans saw acceptable overhead. The Red Ball Express was also a marvel of fuel management. Its own operations consumed 300 gallons of gasoline daily, yet fuel shortages never crippled it. This was due to a parallel system of tanker convoys and forward fuel dumps placed every 25 miles along the route. Operation Pluto, the undersea pipeline pumping gasoline from Britain, provided a steady flow that German intelligence never detected in time. The result was a system where trucks could refuel almost without stopping. To the Germans, who rationed fuel so tightly that entire divisions often stood idle, this abundance was incomprehensible. One captured officer later remarked in disbelief, "They burn more fuel moving fuel than we allocate to whole armies." For the men on the ground, the Red Ball Express became more than logistics. It was a culture. Drivers, most of them African American, developed camaraderie and resilience under punishing conditions. They gave their trucks nicknames, painted slogans, and created unwritten rules of the road. Slower vehicles had to give way, breakdowns were shoved aside, anyone under 20 miles per hour was effectively a hazard. They learned to operate on stimulants, caffeine, and sheer willpower, driving for 72 hours straight, hallucinating from fatigue, yet refusing to quit. The work was deadly. By the end of the operation, 300 drivers had been killed in accidents or by enemy action, but morale remained remarkably high. These men understood they were proving something larger than themselves. In a segregated army, denied combat roles and equal rights at home, they had been given a mission that no one else could carry, to keep Patton moving. They seized it with pride. The Germans, watching all of this, felt the psychological weight pressing down on them. Reconnaissance units reported convoys that never seemed to end, headlights stretching into the night. The sound of thousands of engines became a kind of ghostly presence, an endless drone that German soldiers heard in their trenches and villages. Some units reported phantom convoys, hallucinations of trucks that weren't even there, a testament to how deeply the Red Ball had invaded their morale. One German prisoner later admitted, "We knew we were beaten when we heard your trucks at night. Endless trucks, endless supplies. We had 3 rounds per rifle. You had mountains of ammunition. It was not a fair contest." French civilians, too, were profoundly affected. For 4 years they had lived under German occupation, marked by scarcity, rationing, and confiscation. Now they watched convoys rumble past carrying chocolate, cigarettes, soap, and food in such quantities that drivers often shared with the locals. Children gathered along the roads to beg for candy, and the drivers, against regulations, obliged. The symbolism was powerful. The Germans had taken, the Americans gave freely, and their generosity reinforced the image of an unstoppable liberating force. Resistance activity skyrocketed along the Red Ball routes, fueled by the sense that Allied victory was inevitable. German intelligence reported with alarm that civilian morale had flipped entirely, in large part because of the truck convoys. Even the material itself carried symbolic power. The GMC CCK WWII truck became the icon of the Red Ball Express. Mass-produced by General Motors, more than 500 of them rolled off assembly lines during the war, more trucks than the entire German military possessed in total. They were sturdy, reliable, and versatile, able to ford streams, run on low-grade fuel, and endure punishing terrain. German engineers marveled at features they had not implemented in their own vehicles. All-wheel drive as standard, waterproofing, heaters, and engines designed for easy replacement rather than repair. To the Germans, the WWII was more than a truck. It was a symbol of American industrial dominance. By mid-September, the Red Ball Express had become more than an operation. It was a spectacle of abundance that contrasted sharply with German desperation. To German generals, it was a nightmare that defied every assumption about the limits of logistics. To French civilians, it was a promise of liberation made visible on their roads. To the American drivers, it was a grueling, dangerous, but profoundly meaningful mission that gave them a place in history. And to the Allied High Command, it was proof that in modern war, the side that mastered logistics held the key to victory. By early September 1944, the Red Ball Express was operating at a scale and intensity no logistics officer had ever envisioned. What had been designed as a temporary emergency measure was now sustaining an entire army group as it surged toward the German border. Yet as Patton's Third Army and other Allied forces advanced deeper into France, the strain on the Red Ball Express reached breaking point. The round trips grew longer, trucks wore down faster, and drivers, already exhausted, faced grueling conditions that pushed human endurance beyond reasonable limits. What seemed in August to be a miracle was by mid-September at risk of collapse. The mathematics of distance made the problem inevitable. As the Third Army pushed farther east, the convoy routes stretched past 700 miles for a single round trip. What had once been a 40-hour drive in one direction now consumed nearly 20 hours, even before accounting for fuel stops or traffic jams. Drivers were spending nearly 2 full days behind the wheel, often with little rest in between runs. Vehicles, meanwhile, were disintegrating under the pressure. The deuce-and-a-half trucks, sturdy though they were, had an average service life of 30,000 miles. On the Red Ball Express, they were lucky to survive 10,000 before being abandoned or cannibalized. Tires shredded by the thousands, engines overheated, suspensions snapped. At the height of operations, 30% of trucks were out of action on any given day. German intelligence, carefully tracking the convoys, saw signs of strain. Reports noted that convoy intervals had slowed from every 5 minutes to every 15. Speeds, once a steady 35 miles per hour, were dropping to 20 or less on some stretches. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of a panzer corps, reported in early September that American supply lines show signs of collapse. Vehicle intervals have widened, convoys slowed. This is our opportunity. The Germans hoped that, like their own advance into Russia, the Americans had simply outrun their logistics. But the Americans responded with speed and flexibility that the Wehrmacht could not have imagined. Within 72 hours of detecting these strains, the Red Ball Express reorganized itself completely. Instead of relying on single, massive end-to-end hauls, the system was broken into shorter segments with intermediate transfer points. Trucks now carried supplies partway, unloaded at hubs, and returned quickly, while fresh vehicles carried cargo farther forward. This effectively cut the journey times in half, reducing driver exhaustion and keeping more vehicles in service. At the same time, maintenance depots were moved forward, closer to the front, so repairs could be made without pulling trucks out of the system entirely. The Americans also doubled down on redundancy. New truck companies were assigned to the route, increasing the fleet to nearly 7,000 vehicles at peak operation. Additional drivers were pulled from other units, trained rapidly, and thrown into convoys. The flexibility of the system meant that it could absorb shocks without losing momentum. Where German planners required weeks to redesign their supply chains, the Red Ball Express adapted overnight. What looked like collapse on September 8 became recovery and even expansion by September 12. Another innovation was the increasing use of aerial supply. The U.S. Army Air Forces diverted hundreds of C-47 transport planes to deliver critical cargo directly to forward units. Each aircraft could carry about 3 tons, but with hundreds flying daily, the effect was significant. On September 16 alone, German observers counted 900 transport flights delivering more than 700 tons of supplies by air. To the Luftwaffe, crippled by fuel shortages and losses, such an effort was unthinkable. At Stalingrad, they had managed just 300 tons per day at their peak, and even then, only for a short time. The Americans, by contrast, treated air transport as a normal extension of the Red Ball system, accepting losses as a cost of doing business. The strain was not limited to machines. The drivers themselves bore a terrible burden. Many worked for 72 hours straight, sustained only by caffeine, stimulants, and sheer willpower. Exhaustion led to hallucinations, accidents, and deadly mistakes. Trucks overturned on icy or rain. Slick roads collided in fog or caught fire from overheated engines. By the end of the operation, some 300 drivers had been killed and countless more injured. Yet morale remarkably remained high. Most of these men were African American, serving in a segregated army that denied them combat roles or equal recognition. They knew that their contribution was essential, and they carried that knowledge as a source of pride. Every successful run was both a logistical achievement and a rebuttal of the racist ideologies of both the Nazis abroad and segregation at home. To the Germans, the adaptability of the Red Ball Express was deeply unsettling. Reports poured into headquarters describing an enemy that defied logic. Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Germany's most capable commanders, remarked in despair, "They waste resources because they have infinite resources. They do not fear us because they have no reason to fear us. This is not war as we understand it. This is civilization against scarcity. For men who had grown up on the gospel of strict discipline, conservation, and efficiency, the American method seemed almost alien, yet it worked, and it kept working even under conditions that should have destroyed it. The battlefield impact was devastating. German doctrine calculated that under the best conditions, armored divisions could advance 20 to 30 miles a day before supply lines failed. Patton's divisions, supplied by the Red Ball Express, doubled that. On one occasion, the 4th Armored Division advanced 35 miles in the morning, paused at noon to refuel and rearm, and then drove another 30, 2 miles by evening. Such tempo shattered German defenses designed around slower, predictable movements. Entire units were outflanked and destroyed simply because they could not believe the Americans could move so fast for so long. Even weather failed to halt the convoys. As autumn rains turned roads into mud and early winter brought freezing conditions, trucks kept rolling. Drivers wrapped chains around tires, poured alcohol into radiators, and pressed on. German doctrine held that wheeled logistics were impossible below -10 degrees Celsius. Yet Red Ball convoys moved through ice and snow, albeit at reduced speeds. The Germans, who saw their own transport grind to a halt in bad weather, were astonished to see Americans barreling forward regardless of conditions. By October, the Red Ball Express had been operating continuously for more than 6 weeks. It had delivered over 400 tons of supplies, kept Patton's Third Army advancing at unprecedented speed, and forced German planners to rewrite every assumption about logistics. The system consumed itself at a furious rate. 50 trucks destroyed or abandoned, tens of thousands of tires burned through, millions of gallons of fuel expended. Yet the Americans accepted such attrition as the natural cost of victory. Ships kept unloading replacements. Factories kept producing parts and drivers. Exhausted but determined, kept climbing into their cabs. The Germans, increasingly demoralized, began to admit the truth. They were not simply fighting an army, but an industrial empire. They had underestimated what it meant for the United States to harness its entire economy for war. Trucks, drivers, and fuel poured into France in numbers that no European nation could ever hope to match. In the words of one captured German officer, "You industrialized war." We never understood what that meant until it was too late. By November 1944, the Red Ball Express had accomplished what many had believed impossible. In just 82 days of operation, it had delivered more than 412,000 tons of supplies across nearly 122 million ton-miles, using close to 6,000 trucks and 23,000 drivers. It consumed staggering amounts of fuel, over 57 million gallons, and wore out 180,000 tires. More than 50,000 vehicles were destroyed or abandoned along the routes. Yet the system never failed in its central mission, keeping Patton's Third Army and other Allied forces advancing relentlessly toward the German border. What had begun as a desperate improvisation had transformed into the most decisive logistics operation of the European war. The numbers alone tell the story. 40,000 tons of ammunition were delivered to Patton's forces alone. 15 million rations kept soldiers fed. More than 135,000 tons of medical supplies reached field hospitals, saving tens of thousands of lives. At peak capacity, 7,000 trucks were on the road, with convoys spaced every 5 minutes. It was an operation on such a scale that German generals, accustomed to scarcity and meticulous rationing, could scarcely comprehend it. In captivity, one Wehrmacht officer admitted, "We multiplied our best logistical performance by 3 to estimate what you could achieve. We were wrong by a factor of 10, but the legacy of the Red Ball Express extended far beyond numbers." It was, above all, a psychological weapon that devastated German morale. Wehrmacht soldiers heard the endless drone of truck engines at night and knew what it meant: an enemy supplied in depth, an enemy with no logistical limit. German units rationed 3 rounds of ammunition per rifle, while Americans fired shells in the hundreds of thousands without pause. At Metz, American artillery expended 1 100,000 rounds in a single decisive, lied entirely by Red Ball convoys, while German gunners rationed 50 shells per gun. The disparity was crushing, and soldiers at the front felt the hopelessness of fighting an opponent who could never be starved of material. Field Marshal Walter Model, perhaps the most respected of Germany's commanders, summed up the despair. If these reports are accurate, we face not a superior army, but a superior civilization. His words captured the realization that the Americans were not merely waging war with tactics and weapons, but with factories, machines, and an industrial philosophy that treated war as production. For German officers, this realization was as demoralizing as any battlefield defeat. As one prisoner put it simply, we knew we had lost when we understood your supply system. The Red Ball Express was also a weapon against ideology. Nazi racial theories declared African Americans inferior, incapable of technical skill or initiative. Yet 75% of the Red Ball's drivers were African American soldiers, operating under punishing conditions and proving indispensable to the Allied victory. These men, denied equal rights at home, barred from combat roles, and forced to serve in segregated units, were now sustaining the most celebrated general in Europe. They drove through exhaustion, through weather, through accidents and breakdowns, making possible advances that reshaped the war. Every mile they drove was a direct contradiction of Hitler's racial fantasies, and, ironically, of segregationist assumptions in their own army. Their contribution did not go unnoticed. General Eisenhower himself, visiting Red Ball operations in September 1944, remarked that these men were winning the war as surely as any infantry. His aide, Captain Harry Butcher, recorded Eisenhower's observation with a sense of astonishment. The Supreme Commander had seen black soldiers, denied equality in civilian life, keeping his armies alive through sheer endurance and determination. The contradiction was glaring, and it planted seeds of change. 3 years later, in 1947, President Truman ordered the desegregation of the U.S. military. While many factors contributed to that historic decision, the performance of African American soldiers in operations like the Red Ball Express provided undeniable proof of their ability and courage. The legacy also reshaped logistics itself. Veterans of the Red Ball Express returned to the United States after the war with unmatched experience in operating massive transportation networks. Many went on to found trucking companies, design highway systems, and build the infrastructure of modern America. Companies like Yellow Freight and Consolidated Freightways traced their origins to veterans who had learned, on the roads of France, that speed and volume could move the world. The principles they absorbed, redundancy, standardization, and improvisation, became the foundations of the post-war trucking industry. In this sense, the Red Ball Express was not only a wartime miracle but the birthplace of modern logistics. Perhaps its greatest legacy, however, was the way it redefined the meaning of logistics in war. For centuries, generals had treated supply as a secondary concern, something to be managed quietly in the background, while strategy and tactics took center stage. The Red Ball Express proved the opposite. Logistics was not merely support, it was strategy itself. The ability to move supplies faster than the enemy could react was as decisive as any tank or aircraft. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the German commander in the West, grasped this truth when he told his staff in September 1944. The Americans have created a supply system that makes distance irrelevant. We are fighting the last war. They are fighting the next one. When the Red Ball Express was finally discontinued on November 16, 1944, after 82 days of continuous operation, it left behind not only war, not trucks and battered roads, but also a new understanding of warfare. The operation had shortened the war in Europe by at least 6 months, saving countless lives. Its cost, an estimated $100 million, including destroyed vehicles and damaged infrastructure, was considered cheap compared to the $250 million America spent on each single day of war. In that light, the Red Ball Express was not only effective but also economical. Decades later, the memory of the Red Ball Express lived on. In 1994, the U.S. Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp honoring the operation. At the ceremony, veterans, many of them African-American drivers, stood proudly as they remembered the months when they had kept the engines of victory running. They spoke of exhaustion, accidents, and hardship, but also of pride in having proved their worth, pride in having defeated Hitler's ideology with every truckload delivered. General Patton himself offered perhaps the most fitting tribute. In his memoirs, he wrote, "The truck drivers of the Red Ball Express deserved as much credit for the defeat of Germany as any combat unit. They drove through exhaustion, through mechanical failure, through weather that stopped armor. Without them, the Third Army doesn't move. Without movement, we don't win." His words recognized what history has sometimes overlooked, that the war in Europe was not won only by soldiers on the battlefield, but also by drivers in the cab of a 2- and a half-ton truck, grinding their way along French roads in endless convoys. In the end, the Red Ball Express was more than a supply line. It was a demonstration of industrial power, of improvisational spirit, of racial courage, and of the new reality of modern war. The German generals who laughed at American logistics in August 1944 surrendered in May 1945 to armies that had been sustained by those very trucks. As one anonymous German officer admitted in 1944, watching the endless stream of convoys, "We prepared for everything. Your tanks, your planes, your ships. We never prepared for your trucks." That statement, perhaps more than any statistic, captures the essence of the Red Ball Express. It was not glamorous, not elegant, not even efficient by traditional standards, but it was unstoppable, and in modern war, unstoppable supply meant unstoppable victory.